we'll start with a simpler sheep story, one that will be familiar to many of you. So these herders, they share a common pasture, and every so often they have to ask themselves, should I add more animals to my herd? And these herders, they have a good business sense, like the bankers here in Zurich. And they say, well, what's the cost? What's the benefit? If I add more animals to my herd, that's more things I have to sell at market. That's good. What's the downside? Well, they're just grazing on this common pasture. It doesn't cost me very much. And so there's really no harm in adding more animals to my herd. But you know where this is going. When everybody thinks the same way, there are so many animals that the pasture can't support them, and they all die, and everybody ends up worse off. So this is, of course, Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. And it's a parable told many years ago, but it really captures the central problem of human social life, which is the tension between self-interest and group interest, between me and us. The tragedy is that if everybody does what's best for them as individuals, then everybody ends up worse off. And this is, I think, the fundamental problem that human morality was designed to solve. So how do we solve this problem? It uses technology that's much older. So I like to think of the human mind and the human brain as being like this camera that I got years ago. The nice thing about this camera, especially for someone like me, is that it has these automatic settings. So you put it in landscape mode, you take a picture of your mountain from far away, and it works pretty well, point and shoot. And the nice thing about having these automatic settings is that they're very efficient. But they're not everything. They're not very flexible. They're good for what they're good for, and if you have some special purpose in mind or you're in some special circumstance, then you're going to need to put your camera in manual mode so you can adjust the f-stop and everything else by hand. And the nice thing about having both automatic settings and manual mode is that it allows you to navigate the trade-off between efficiency and flexibility. And our brains do a similar sort of thing. Our automatic settings are our intuitions, often our emotional gut reactions about things that give us pretty good advice most of the time for familiar situations. We also have a manual mode. We have a capacity for explicit reasoning where we can think about the details of a situation and think about exactly what we're trying to achieve and try to choose a path that will get us to where we want to go. And what I'd like to start with is an experiment that asks a question about the relationship between the sort of fast automatic thinking and slow reasoned thinking when it comes to the tragedy of the commons. So the laboratory version of the tragedy of the commons is called the public goods game. And it works like this. So let's say 4 people come into the lab, and everybody would do this in the United States. Everybody gets $10 to start with, and everybody has a choice. You can keep your $10, or you can put your money into a common pool. Whatever goes into the pool gets doubled by the experimenters, and it gets divided equally among all 4 people. Now, if you do the math, you realize that the way to maximize the benefit for yourself, for me, is to keep all of your money, because then you get your $10, plus you get your share of whatever everybody else put in and got doubled, right? So that's how you do what's best for me. If you want to do what's best for us, you put all of your money in, because that maximizes the amount for the total that goes to the group. And what we wanted to know is, what role do intuitions or reasoning play in this kind of process? Or maybe there's no distinctive influence of either. So what we did was we had people make these kinds of be selfish or be cooperative decisions, and we manipulated the time that people had to think about these things. So if you look here at the yellow bar, this is the amount that people contributed, about 60% on average of what they could have when there was no time constraint. Some people were told, you have to decide quickly, you have to decide within 10 seconds. And interestingly, those people put in more money on average. And other people were told, you have to stop and think for at least 10 seconds before you make your decision. And those people, on average, put in less. Now, so this is interesting. It suggests that at least with some people, some of the time in some situations, being good to other people is the more automatic thing to do, which you might think is the opposite of what you might expect. You might think either that people are intuitively selfish, but then their reasoning makes them more cooperative, or that there's no tension at all. People just have their preferences and they do what they want without any kind of internal battle. Now, some people looked at this research and they said, oh, this means people are innately good, but I don't think that's the case. I think it depends a lot on people's personal experiences, their cultural background, as we'll see later. If you ask people, we divided people into 2 groups based on how they answered this question. Do you trust the people you interact with in daily life? And they showed this effect. But the people who said that they don't trust the people in daily life that they interact with, their first thought was, I'm keeping my money, and their second thought was, I'm keeping my money, and as a result, the time pressure doesn't make any difference. So this is something that works some of the time for some people in some contexts. And it illustrates a more general pattern in research on moral psychology, which is that we have different kinds of emotions that make us able to solve this problem. So we have positive emotions that motivate ourselves. If you care about other people, that makes you want to contribute. We have negative emotions that motivate ourselves. I would feel guilty if everybody else cooperated and I didn't. We have positive emotions that motivate other people, and we have negative emotions that motivate other people. And all of these different intuitive emotional processes, these automatic settings, enable us to solve the tragedy of the commons, to put some weight on us and not just all of it on me. Okay, so we've talked about automatic settings. What about the manual mode? And here, the best place to see manual mode in action is in moral dilemmas. And this is where the philosophy comes in. So a classic moral dilemma from the philosophy literature is this one. This trolley is headed towards 5 people, but you can save those 5 people by hitting a switch that will turn the trolley away from the 5 and onto a different track where there's 1 person. So what goes on in your head? Well, here's the idea. Your manual mode looks at the numbers and says 5 lives for 1. That sounds good. You should hit the switch. And here there's not much of an emotional response. And as a result, your manual mode easily wins and you say yes. And you give an answer that we call a utilitarian answer, which in this case just means you're going with the costs and benefits as opposed to some other kind of judgment, for other basis for making your decision. In a similar case, which we call the footbridge case, now the trolley is headed towards 5 people, but this time the only way you can save them is to push this big guy off of the footbridge. He'll land on the tracks and he'll get killed, but it'll stop the trolley from killing those 5 people. Now, here, the psychology is rather different. And by the way, we're assuming, yes, this will work, and no, you can't jump yourself and all those things you very smart people are thinking. Trust me, we've controlled for this. Here, again, people think 5 lives for 1. This makes sense. But here there's an emotional response that people have that makes them say, in general, no, this is not okay. And this response is consistent with a kind of Kantian or deontological perspective that says the ends don't justify the means. Even if you could save those 5 people, this would be a violation of that person's rights. Now, this is a theory, essentially, that I've told you, but what's the evidence for it? Well, there's been a lot over the last 10 or 15 years. I'll give you one example. So many of you have probably heard of Phineas Gage, the famous case of the person with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is a part of the brain that plays an important role in integrating emotional signals into decisions. So if our model is right, that it's an emotional response that's making you say, no, don't push the guy off the footbridge, then if you look at patients like this who have damage to this region, then you would expect them to give more utilitarian answers. And that's exactly what other researchers have found. That is, patients with this kind of damage are twice, sometimes depending on the case, 5 times as likely to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. So this is giving us evidence that there are different circuits within the brain that are pushing in different directions when we face this kind of moral dilemma. A more recent experiment from my lab. Here we ask people to think about cases like the footbridge case, but we asked them to do it in 3 different ways. So sometimes we said, just tell us very simply which option will produce the best outcomes. Sometimes we said, don't tell us what's right or wrong, just tell us which do you feel worse about. And then in other cases, we did what we normally do, which is we asked them to make an all things considered judgment. And what we found, which is consistent with past research, is that this part of the brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is very much a manual mode region involved in explicit reasoning, doing math problems, resisting an impulse, all of those kinds of things. That's what you see more active, among other things, when people are just thinking about the costs and benefits. When people are just reporting on their emotional response, the extent to which they say they feel bad tracks with activity in a part of the brain called the amygdala, which, to simplify things, you can think of as a kind of emotional alarm bell going off saying, hey, this is not good or requires more attention. And then when people have to make the all things considered judgment, you see activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, integrating those 2 signals into a kind of judgment. Now, what are we reacting to? A lot of you probably, when I describe the footbridge case, you sort of see it in your mind's eye, and we wanted to know, does this visualization actually have an influence on people's judgments? So while people were making their decisions, some of the time people had to do a memory task involving shapes, which is a visual task, others with words. And we found what we predicted, which is that when people had their visual imagery interfered with by doing this visual memory task, they were more likely to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge and other things like that, indicating that the visualization is an important part of this story. One more experiment before we get to a stopping point. Here, you're in this rescue boat and you can save this one person who's drowning, and then you get a signal that says, wait, there are these other people over there that you can save. Now, if you're going to decide which way to go, you want to know, well, how many lives are at stake over there, and what are my odds of actually saving them, the probability and the magnitude. And we did a brain imaging study where we tried to understand what in the brain is keeping track of these different factors and putting them together into a decision. And to make a long story short, what we found is that a very basic mammalian circuit in the brain that in rats, in monkeys, in humans as well, is involved in tracking reward value in general, is keeping track of the value, taking into account how many lives you can save and also the probability of saving them. In much the same way that a rat would do if it's foraging and trying to figure out if it should get the easy food here or the good food, but it's uncertain food over there. So many of you may remember Commander Data from Star Trek, who's an artificially intelligent being whose goal is to try to become more human. And part of the story with Data is that in addition to his other intelligent features, he has what they call an ethical subroutine. This is not helping Data become more human, because as I've shown you, there's really no special place in the brain where morality lives. Instead, when we engage in moral decision making, it's using the same kinds of circuits that we use for a lot of other things, visualizing something, integrating an alarm signal like might be in response to seeing a snake, but nothing to do with morality, reasoning processes, keeping track of magnitudes of rewards and the probabilities of rewards. None of this is really specific to morality. If there's something specific to morality in the brain, we haven't found it yet. This raises the question, well, if morality is not a special thing in the brain, then what actually is it? And I think it goes back to what I said earlier, that the way to think about morality is it's not defined by the mechanics in the head, it's defined by the social function. It's different kinds of psychological and neural processes that enable us to be cooperative, to put us ahead of me. And you can think of it this way. There are many different kinds of vehicles, and they have different mechanics. A sailboat is more like a kite than a motorcycle, and a motorcycle is more like a lawnmower than a sailboat. But they both are vehicles because of the function they serve and not because of the mechanics that they use to serve it. Okay, so we've talked about the features of morality. What about the bugs? And to appreciate, I think, where our moral thinking is most likely to go wrong, I want to give you my sequel to Hardin's parable. So here we have a different kind of pasture, and we have this group of herders over here, and they've solved the me versus us problem by being communists. So they say, not only are we going to have a common pasture, we're going to have a common herd, and everything is shared, and that's how we'll solve the problem. Maybe this works, maybe it doesn't, but it's a strategy. A different strategy is the free market herders over here. They say we're going to not have a common herd and we're not going to have a common pasture. We'll privatize it. And as a result, our cooperation will consist in just respecting each other's property rights. So more collectivist, more individualist. And these tribes of herders may pray to different gods. They have different rituals, different beliefs about, can women be herders? Is it okay for two male herders to marry each other? In the US, the big question is, can you defend your sheep with an assault weapon? Things like that. Different ways of being cooperative. And then what happens, one day, a fire burns down the forest in the middle, and then the rains come, and there's this lovely pasture in between. And they look at this pasture and they say, nice pasture. And they want to move in. And the question is, how is life going to be governed on that new pasture? This is the modern moral problem. It's not about individuals being selfish versus being moral. It's about different groups with different values and different interests, and together trying to find some larger system that can help different moral tribes live together. And this is where our instincts, our automatic settings, are not necessarily going to serve us so well, at least not all of the time. So in a lovely set of studies done by Benedict Herman and colleagues, they had people in different cities around the world do the tragedy of the commons public goods game. And in their study, people did this many times, and they could punish each other financially after each round if they didn't like the way they played. And you see three different patterns of activity, patterns of behavior. So in places like Boston and nearby St. Gallen and in Copenhagen, right from the beginning, this is the top black line, people put the dotted line, people put money in right from the start, and cooperation stays high. Very nice. In other places like Chengdu and Seoul and Melbourne, people start out putting a little bit of money in some, and then the people punish the people who are not cooperating, and by the end it looks like lovely Copenhagen. And then you have other places like Istanbul and Riyadh and Athens where people don't put a lot of money in and cooperation stays low. And they're wondering, why didn't cooperation rise up? And what they found was, in these places, not only did a lot of people didn't cooperate, but some of the people who didn't want to cooperate, who kept their money, would punish the people who did. And they asked them afterwards, say, why are you paying to punish people who were giving you money? And they said, you know what, I don't like this whole thing. I don't know who you are. I don't know who these people are. And this whole thing just feels wrong to me, right? And now, if you've been to Athens, the people there are very nice, right? So it's not that these are selfish people. They can be very generous. But what the research suggests is that the scope of cooperation is smaller. And this can work well in a tribe, but it doesn't necessarily work well on a global scale. I wouldn't want to put societies like this in charge of certain modern moral problems, such as dealing with climate change, something we'll come to later. So another moral parable, you're driving along and there's a guy who's bleeding by the side of the road, and he's going to lose his leg if he doesn't get in your car and you take him to the hospital. How many of you think it would be terrible to let him bleed by the side of the road if you were worried about ruining your leather seats? Raise your hands. Okay, so a lot of you, okay. Different case, you can take the money that you would spend on leather seats and give it to an international aid organization that can probably save somebody's life with that money. How many of you think you're a terrible person if you don't give the money and instead spend it on your car? Right? Not a lot of hands going up. So what's the difference here? So in an experiment I did with Jay Musin, we asked people about a case where people were in desperate need in a place that's far away from here, but you're there on vacation when a terrible typhoon hits and they desperately need money for the relief effort. And in this experiment, and then in a different case, we asked people the same situation, but you're far away at home and you're getting this information over the internet, and you can help just as much by donating to an international aid organization. And when it's described as up close, in this sample, 68% of people said that you have an obligation to help. When it's exactly the same situation and you can help just as much and you know all of the details just as much, but half as many people say that you have an obligation to help just when it's being described as far away. Now, to me, that seems kind of buggy. I mean, when you ask why should our moral obligations depend on how far away physically somebody is, to me, that seems like a problem. Maybe you disagree. Another case, going back to the experiment I showed you before, we've noticed, and other people have noticed, that when you talk about saving one life, people think it's worth a lot. If you're getting to 1,000 lives and you say, well, if you could save one more, people don't seem to value that much. You get diminishing returns for saving lives when you look at people's judgment. Why would that be the case? Well, remember I told you that it's our basic mammalian reward system that seems to be keeping track of these values. And if you're a rat, once you've had enough cheese, you're sort of full. And it seems like we're following the same kind of pattern making moral judgments, where once you've saved a certain number of lives, you feel morally full. Now, does that make sense? Is the 1,000th life that you could save worth less than the first life you can save? I'm not sure that makes a lot of sense. But if we're using our basic rat brains to think about these problems, it could lead to that kind of conclusion. One more example. So in the footbridge case I described, in this sample, about 30% of people say it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge to save people. If you change it so that instead of pushing the guy with your bare hands, you hit a switch that drops the guy through a trap door, now about twice as many people say that it's okay. Now, you're laughing, and you're laughing because that seems a little bit crazy. Whether you should save these 5 lives depends on whether you're pushing or hitting a switch. Something a little bit buggy here. So how do we fix these bugs? Well, obviously there's no easy answer, but I want to give you a sort of general shape of the answer that I favor. So as I said, the core way we solve the basic moral problem is with our fast thinking, with our intuitions. And that works pretty well for the tragedy of the commons, for the me versus us problem. But when we're dealing with the problems of modern life, when we're dealing with the problems of the new pasture, different groups with different values, problems that nature never anticipated, like climate change, or what we should do about a new technology like CRISPR, our intuitions are probably not going to help us very much. And we need more general principles. And this is really the project of modern moral philosophy, to try to transcend tribal values and ask, is there some kind of moral system or some sort of set of principles that can be used in some sense as a universal guideline for what's ethical or what's not, and for how our society ought to be organized? Now, I'm not going to tell you what my preferred answer is, but I'm going to I'll give you an example from one of my favorite philosophers. So Jeremy Bentham, who's one of the founding fathers of the utilitarian or consequentialist school of thought in moral philosophy, was actually one of the first people to defend what we now call gay rights. He said, "I have been tormenting myself for years to find, if possible, a sufficient ground for treating gays with the severity with which they are treated at this time of day by all European nations." So at this point, punishable by death if you lived as an openly gay person. But upon the principle of utility, I can find none. Now, at his time, this was a crazy idea. But how did he reach this conclusion? Well, he had a more general philosophy. He came to the conclusion that everybody's well-being matters equally, and that what really matters ultimately is the quality of people's experience, whether people are happy or whether people are suffering. And he said, you know what? It seems to me that being gay is this terrible, horrible thing, and everybody else, at least in my circle, but where's the harm, really? And why should we deny the people the right to live the way they want to live if it's not really hurting anybody? And with that willingness to step back from his fast thinking, from his gut reactions, at least in my opinion, he jumped ahead 2 centuries in moral time. And I'll add that I think Bentham and John Stuart Mill, his intellectual successor, really raised and got right, I think, a lot of the major issues of their day, from slavery to free speech, environmental protection, workers' rights, women's rights, and so on and so forth. I think it's this willingness to detach oneself from one's gut reactions that enables one, in many cases, to make progress. So whether or not you agree with Bentham's philosophy, and a lot of people have criticized it, and I think legitimately so, the more general point I want to make is this, that when you're dealing with the problems of everyday life, when it's basic selfishness versus the interests of others, that's when we're most likely, I think, to do well relying on our gut reactions, relying on that fast, automatic kind of thinking, because that's what our intuitions evolve for, both biologically and culturally, and as the result of our learned experience. But when we're dealing with modern moral problems, again, different tribes with different values, with different interests, technology creating new problems and new opportunities that we don't necessarily have reliable experience with at the gut level, this is where we need to shift into manual mode and be willing to think in a little bit more of an abstract way. And to come back to Commander Data, his quest is to try to be more human, but that may not be the best goal. Our human morality has a lot of great features, but as I hope I've convinced you, it also has a lot of bugs. And if we're going to try to live together on the new pastures of the modern world with our different interests and different moral perspectives, it's not enough for us simply to try to be as human as possible. We have to try to transcend the limitations of our intuitive tribal thinking, and through a kind of interplay between reasoning and our gut reactions, arrive at policies and arrive at a social order that's not just human, but also more humane. So, thank you.